A frail duke bought a single night of nursing, but their closeness became forbidden love. The wind was a cruel thief that night, snatching the last of the autumn warmth from the world and rattling the loose shutter of Alara's cottage like a beggar's cup. It was a sound she knew intimately, the sound of emptiness, of want. Inside, the fire was a miserly thing, a few embers clinging to a log she could ill afford to burn. By its meager light, she stitched a patch onto the sleeve of her father's old coat, the only thing of substance he had left her besides his knowledge of herbs and a legacy of quiet dignity. The wool was worn thin, a ghost of a garment, but it was all that stood between her and the coming winter. Each pull of the needle was a small act of defiance against the encroaching cold, against the hunger that gnawed with a dull, persistent ache in her belly. The cottage, once a place of comfort and shared stories, now felt vast and silent, its shadows filled with the memory of a hearty laugh and the scent of his pipe tobacco. Now, there was only the scent of dried willow bark and the lonely whisper of the wind. A sharp, authoritative rap on the door shattered the quiet. It was not the knock of a neighbor. It was hard, impatient, the sound of wealth and power. Alara's heart gave a frightened leap. Such sounds did not belong here, in this forgotten corner of the village where life was measured in seasons and harvests, not in clanging summons. She tucked the needle into the coat's lapel and smoothed her worn woolen dress, a futile gesture of propriety, before unlatching the door. A man stood on her threshold, silhouetted against the bruised twilight. He was dressed in the severe black and silver livery of the Duke of Blackwood, the reclusive master of the great, brooding manor that loomed on the hill like a permanent storm cloud. The man's face was stone, his eyes sweeping over her small cottage with unconcealed disdain. "You are the healer Alara?" he asked, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. It was not a question so much as a confirmation. "I am," she replied, her own voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She lifted her chin, a gesture inherited from her father, a refusal to be cowed. "His Grace, the Duke, requires your services." For tonight, he did not elaborate. He did not need to. The Duke's ill health was a subject of dark rumor in the village. A curse, some said, a wound from the war that would not heal, a malady of the soul that manifested in the flesh. Alara's mind raced. The Duke was a phantom, a man seen only in glimpses, a remote and formidable power. To be summoned to the manor was unheard of. "The village has a physician," she began, her instincts screaming caution. "The physician has been dismissed," the man cut in sharply. "His Grace's affliction is particular. He requires a nurse for the night. You will be paid." He named a sum that made the air rush from Alara's lungs. It was more money than she had seen in a year, enough to buy firewood for the entire winter, flour, salted meat, a new coat. It was the answer to a prayer she had been too weary to even whisper. It was salvation, and it felt like a trap. "Why me?" she asked, the words soft but firm. The man's gaze flickered. For the first time, a hint of something other than arrogance entered his expression. Frustration, perhaps even desperation. "Your father was known for his discretion. It is hoped the daughter has inherited the trait. You will attend the Duke through the fever. You will speak of it to no one. Is that understood?" The fever. So the rumors were true. A recurring ailment that the finest physicians could not cure. She looked past the steward, at the skeletal branches of the trees clawing at the sky. Winter was coming. Discretion was a small price to pay for survival. "I understand," she said, her voice clear and resolved. She turned, gathering her small leather satchel of herbs, chamomile for calm, feverfew for the heat, willow bark for the pain. Each was a familiar friend, a small piece of her world she could bring into the unknown. When she faced the man again, she was no longer just a frightened girl in a threadbare dress. She was the healer. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a silent ascent into another world. The carriage, sprung with a luxury that made her feel every bump in the village road seem a personal affront, climbed the winding path toward the great house. The manor did not welcome. It loomed. Its stone walls were black with age and rain, its windows dark and watchful eyes. It was a place built to keep the world out, a fortress of solitude and sorrow. Inside, the silence was even more profound, a heavy, suffocating presence that clung to the tapestries and lurked in the vaulted ceilings. The air was cold, smelling of dust and something else, something akin to decay. Not of the body, but of the spirit. She was led through a labyrinth of hallways, her simple clogs echoing on the polished marble floors where generations of nobility had trod. The steward left her at a heavy oak door, his final instruction a terse command. "His Grace is within. Attend him." Alara pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was vast, dominated by a cavernous fireplace where a large fire battled valiantly but unsuccessfully against the chamber's chill. A massive four-poster bed, draped in dark velvet curtains, stood like a catafalque in the center of the room, and in a high-backed chair near the fire sat the Duke. Lord Alastair, the Duke of Blackwood, was nothing like the whispers in the village. They spoke of a monster, a broken man. The man before her was formidable. He was younger than she expected, though his dark hair was threaded with premature silver at the temples. His face was a study in harsh, beautiful lines, a face that might have been sculpted by a master if the sculptor had, in a fit of pique, dragged a chisel across one side. A scar, pale and jagged, ran from his right temple down to the hard line of his jaw. It was not grotesque, but it was arresting, a permanent record of violence. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter storm, intelligent, piercing, and utterly weary. They held the weight of a pain far older than any fever. "So," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "you are the village miracle worker." There was no warmth in his tone, only a dry, cutting cynicism. Alara did not flinch. She set her satchel on a small table and met his gaze directly. "I am a healer, Your Grace. I work with what the earth provides, not with miracles." A flicker of surprise in those stormy eyes. He had expected fear, or perhaps simpering deference. He had not expected calm, professional dignity. "My men tell me you have some skill." "My father taught me," she said simply. He believed that nature offers a balm for most ills. And does it offer a balm for this? He gestured vaguely at his own body, a gesture of profound self-disgust. An old wound that refuses to be forgotten? A fever that comes like a thief to steal my reason. He was testing her, she realized, pushing at her, trying to find a crack in her composure. She walked closer, her gaze clinical but not unkind. She could feel the heat radiating from him even from a few feet away. His skin had a feverish sheen, and a fine tremor ran through the hand he had clenched on the arm of the chair. "Fevers are a battle," she said, her voice soft but sure. "The body fights an invader. Sometimes, the memory of the battle is as fierce as the battle itself." She opened her satchel. The familiar, earthy scent of her herbs filled the space between them. A small, honest thing in this opulent, cold room. "May I?" she asked, indicating his wrist. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then, with a curt nod, he extended his arm. His skin was hot and dry beneath her cool fingers. His pulse was a frantic, thready beat, a trapped bird fluttering against the bars of its cage. Her touch was gentle but firm, her focus absolute. For that moment, he was not a duke and she was not a commoner. They were simply a patient and a healer. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the way the scar tissue pulled tight when he clenched his jaw. She saw the man, not the title, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something beyond cynicism, a desperate, buried longing for relief. The night deepened, and the fever tightened its grip. Alastair retreated from the world, lost to a delirium that dragged him back to the mud and blood of a battlefield he had never truly left. He muttered names she did not know, orders and pleas choked with a raw agony that made Alara's heart ache. He thrashed against the sheets, his body a war zone once more. "Hold the line." "Fallón. No." It was a trap. Alara did not leave his side. She moved with a quiet, steady purpose that was the antithesis of his chaos. She brewed the feverfew and willow bark into a bitter tea, coaxing small sips past his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She bathed his face and neck with cloths soaked in cool, lavender-scented water. Her hands were always gentle, her voice a low murmur that seemed to cut through the fog of his pain. "Hush now. You are safe. The battle is over. Rest." She was not a servant cowering before his rank, nor a physician frustrated by his stubborn ailment. She was a calm anchor in his storm. She saw his vulnerability not as a weakness to be pitied, but as a wound to be tended. She saw the man beneath the duke, the soldier still lost on a field of ghosts. In a moment of violent turmoil, he threw out an arm, his hand clamping around her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, wild with fever, focused on her. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice raw. "I am Alara," she said, her voice even showing no fear. "I am here to help you." He stared at her, his brows furrowed in confusion. The madness in his eyes receded slightly, replaced by a glimmer of awareness. "Your hands," he murmured, his grip loosening. "They're cool," he released her, his own hand falling back to the bed, and sank back into the pillows, a fragile truce declared in his internal war. As dawn approached, painting the high, arched windows in shades of gray and rose, the fever finally broke. The violent shivering ceased, replaced by a drenching sweat. His breathing, which had been harsh and ragged, deepened into the slow, even rhythm of true sleep. Alara watched him, her own body aching with exhaustion. The great Duke of Blackwood looked impossibly young in his slumber. The harsh lines of his face softened, the scar less a mark of violence and more a line of sorrow. The formidable wall he built around himself had crumbled in the night, and she had been permitted to see the besieged fortress within. He awoke hours later. The morning sun, weak but persistent, streamed into the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Alara was sitting in the chair he had occupied, dozing lightly, her satchel at her feet. At the sound of his stirring, her eyes opened at once. They were a clear, steady brown, the color of rich earth. "The fever has passed," she stated simply, her voice soft from the long vigil. Alistair pushed himself up on his elbows. He felt weak, scoured out, but his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The usual aftermath of the fever was a crushing headache and a profound sense of shame at his own weakness, witnessed by servants who would whisper in the halls. But this time was different. He felt calm. He looked at the woman in the chair. She was not looking at him with pity or fear. She was looking at him with a quiet, professional assessment. "You stayed," he said. "It was not a question." "That is what I was paid for, Your Grace." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. She had not just occupied the room. She had held it for him, kept the shadows at bay. He remembered fragments of the night. A cool hand on his brow, a quiet voice that was not part of the screaming in his head, the scent of lavender and earth. "The others, the physicians, they give me laudanum. It dulls the mind but does not quiet the ghosts. Laudanum offers escape, not peace," she said, rising and moving to the window. She drew back the heavy curtain, letting in more of the pale light. Sometimes, a fever must be allowed to burn itself out. The body knows the way. He watched her, this small, unassuming woman who moved with such purpose. Her dress was plain. Her hands were not the delicate, useless hands of the ladies at court, but they were skilled and confident. She had faced his demons with him and had not flinched. He felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in his chest, a reluctant admiration, and something else, a desire not to be alone in this cold, vast room anymore. "The steward will see to your payment," he said, the formal words feeling hollow and inadequate. She nodded, gathering her satchel. "I wish you continued health, Your Grace." She was preparing to leave, to walk back out of his life as quietly as she had entered. The thought of the oppressive silence descending once more was unbearable. "Wait," he commanded, his voice sharper than he intended. She paused, her hand on the door latch. He struggled for a reason, any reason. The storm last night, it may have damaged the road. It would be unsafe for you to travel, it was a weak excuse. The wind had howled, but it had not been a tempest. Elara turned, her expression unreadable. She knew it was a lie, but she did not call him on it. She simply waited. "Stay," he said, the word raw, stripped of his ducal authority. It was a plea. Another day. For observation he felt a fool, but he could not let her go. He could not face the silence alone. Not yet. She studied his face for a long moment, and in her clear, honest eyes, he saw not a servant agreeing to a master's whim, but a woman making a choice. "As you wish, your grace," she said, and for the first time since she had arrived, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. The lie of observation stretched from one day into a week. Alistair found increasingly flimsy excuses to keep Elara at the manor. An order of herbs from the city was delayed. He felt a phantom twinge in his old wound that required her poultices. The autumn air was too damp for his constitution, and he needed her teas. It was a farce, and they both knew it. The manor staff, accustomed to the Duke's reclusive and eccentric ways, whispered amongst themselves but obeyed the steward's tight-lipped orders. Elara was given a small, comfortable room in a disused wing of the house, a world away from her drafty cottage. Their days fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. She was not his nurse, not anymore. She became something else, something for which there was no name. He would find himself in the vast, dusty library, a book open but unread in his lap, listening for the soft sound of her footsteps in the hall. She would bring him a tisane in the afternoon, and the ritual would become an excuse for conversation. At first, their talks were stilted, constrained by the chasm of their stations. He asked about her herbs, his questions sharp and intelligent, born of a scholar's curiosity. He was surprised by the depth of her knowledge, the poetry in her descriptions of how yarrow could staunch a wound or how chamomile could soothe a troubled mind. She spoke of the natural world with a reverence that was entirely foreign to him, a world of subtle signs and patient growth that stood in stark contrast to his world of rigid hierarchies and political maneuvering. In turn, Elara found herself looking at the fearsome Duke and seeing a man starved for connection. She began to ask him about the books that lined the library walls from floor to ceiling. His eyes would light up as he spoke of history, of philosophy, of poetry. He pulled down a leather-bound volume of sonnets one afternoon, the rain lashing against the window panes, and read to her. His voice, stripped of its usual cynical edge, was rich and resonant, and the words of love and loss filled the quiet space between them. In that moment, the scar on his face seemed to fade, and she saw the man he might have been before the war, before the wound, before the world had taught him to armor himself in ice. One evening, he dismissed the servants before dinner and asked her to share his meal. The first course was served in unnerving silence at opposite ends of a ridiculously long mahogany table. The distance was a physical manifestation of the social gulf between them. After a moment, Alistair made a frustrated sound and pushed his chair back. "This is absurd," he muttered. He instructed a footman to set a small table for two before the library fire. There, surrounded by the quiet company of books, with the fire casting a warm, flickering glow, the Duke and the village healer shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and wine. The grand pretense fell away. He was just Alistair and she was just Elara. He told her about his childhood, about a younger brother lost to illness, a loss that had first set him on a path of lonely isolation. She, in turn, spoke of her father, of his kindness and wisdom, of the crushing weight of her grief since his passing. "He taught me that every person has a story worth listening to," she said, her gaze soft in the firelight. "He said titles and coin are just cloaks people wear. You have to look at the person beneath." Alistair looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength in her clear eyes, the compassion in the gentle curve of her mouth, the innate dignity that had nothing to do with birth or station. He had spent years pushing the world away, convinced that no one could see past the scar, the title, the darkness he carried within him. But this woman, with her calm gaze and healer's hands, saw it all. And she was not afraid. A dangerous, terrifying warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had long ago dismissed as a youthful folly. It was hope. "My cloak is heavy, Alara," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Then perhaps," she answered, her voice just as soft, "you should let me help you carry it." The intimacy between them deepened with each passing day, a fragile plant taking root in the barren soil of Blackwood Manor. It was a connection built in quiet moments, in the shared silence of watching the fire, in the brief touch of their hands as she passed him a cup of tea, in the way their eyes would meet across a room and hold for a moment longer than necessary. Alistair found himself talking to her as he had never talked to anyone, unburdening himself of the memories that haunted his nights. One night, a savage nightmare ripped him from sleep. He awoke with a strangled cry, the phantom smell of smoke and blood in his nostrils, the echoes of men's screams ringing in his ears. He was back in the ambush, the chaos, the betrayal of a flawed strategy that had cost him his men, his friend, and nearly his own life. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, his body slick with a cold sweat. The door to his chamber creaked open. Alara stood there, holding a single candle, her form silhouetted in its gentle light. She wore a simple nightdress, her long hair unbound and falling over her shoulders. She looked like an apparition of peace in his world of torment. "I heard you cry out," she said softly. There was no alarm in her voice, only a deep, resonant calm. Shame washed over him, hot and swift. It was nothing, a dream. He turned away, not wanting her to see him like this, unmanned, terrified. She did not leave. She walked to his bedside and placed the candle on the table. "Dreams are just memories that have lost their way, Your Grace. They do not have to be faced alone." The simple compassion in her voice broke through his defenses. The story he had held locked inside him for years came pouring out, a torrent of grief and guilt. He told her of Fallon, his closest friend, who had died in his arms. He told her of the weight of command, of sending men to their deaths, of the scar on his face being a constant, physical reminder of his greatest failure. Alara listened without interruption. She did not offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. When he finally fell silent, his voice hoarse with unshed tears, she simply reached out and placed her hand over his, which was clenched into a fist on the velvet coverlet. Her touch was not one of pity, but of solidarity. It was warm and strong and real. "A wound of the body can be mended with stitches and herbs," she said, her voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "But a wound of the soul can only be mended by another soul." He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. Her skin was calloused from her work, so different from the soft, useless hands of the women he was supposed to court. Her hand felt like home. He looked at her, at the candlelight catching the warm tones in her hair and the earnest sympathy in her eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that terrified and exhilarated him, that he was falling in love. He was the Duke of Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and he was falling in love with a common village healer. It was impossible. It was madness. And it was the only thing that had ever felt truly real. The lie he was living, that she was merely his nurse, became a leaden weight in his gut. Every moment of authentic connection was built upon a foundation of deceit, and he knew it could not last. The news arrived via a perfumed letter, delivered by a messenger on a fine, prancing horse that looked utterly out of place in the grim courtyard of Blackwood Manor. The seal was that of his aunt, the formidable Lady Beatrice, Dowager Duchess of Stonehaven. Alistair's heart sank as he read the elegant, looping script. She was coming for a visit, to see to his health and, as she so delicately put it, to discuss matters of dynastic importance. He knew exactly what that meant. His aunt was the chief architect of high society, a woman for whom lineage and advantageous marriages were the very pillars of civilization. She had been parading eligible, blue-blooded ladies before him for years, and his reclusiveness had only made her more determined. The letter was a death knell for the secret, peaceful world he and Alara had built within the castle walls. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. His aunt's eyes missed nothing. She would see Alara, she would see the way he looked at her, and she would tear their world apart with scorn and aristocratic fury. The days leading up to her arrival were fraught with a new, terrible tension. The easy companionship was replaced by a shared, unspoken anxiety. The chasm of their stations, which they had so carefully bridged, seemed to yawn between them once more. Alastair was tormented. He should send Alara away, back to the safety of her cottage, before his aunt arrived. It was the honorable thing to do, the way to protect her from humiliation and scorn. But the thought of it was a physical pain, a tearing in his chest. He had become a desperate addict, and she was his only solace. He could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he retreated into a cold, ducal formality, a desperate and foolish attempt to pretend that nothing had changed, that Alara was still just a healer in his employ. The shift wounded her more deeply than any open argument could have. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a guarded distance. The shared meals ceased. He was once again the lord of the manor and she the servant. Her heart ached with a confused sorrow. Had it all been an illusion? A sick man's fancy? The day before his aunt's arrival, they found themselves in the neglected conservatory at the back of the manor. It had once been a place of beauty, but now the glass was clouded with grime and the exotic plants were withered or overgrown. It was a place of forgotten potential, much like the manor itself. Alara was examining a dying rose bush, her fingers gently touching a brown, brittle leaf. "It's not too late," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "With proper care, it could live again. It just needs light and patience." Her words were a spear in his heart. She was talking about the plant, but he heard a plea for their own fragile connection. He saw then the depth of his cowardice. He was hiding behind his title, preparing to sacrifice her dignity for the sake of avoiding a confrontation with his aunt. "Alara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. He stepped towards her, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to tell her everything, that he loved her, that she had healed a part of him he thought was long dead, that the idea of facing his life without her was a return to a winter of the soul. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The air crackled between them, thick with unspoken words and desperate longing. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. He lowered his head, his lips just a breath from hers. This was it, the moment of truth. The world outside, his aunt, his title, it all fell away. There was only Alara. And then, the sound of a carriage clattering on the cobblestones of the courtyard shattered the moment. Her eyes flew open, filled with alarm. He dropped his hand as if burned. Lady Beatrice had arrived a day early. The storm had broken, and they were standing in the heart of it, utterly exposed. Lady Beatrice was a hawk in dove-gray silk. Her eyes, small and sharp, missed nothing. They swept over the manor's dusty interior with disapproval, catalogued the servants' slightly relaxed discipline, and then settled on Alara, who stood frozen near the conservatory door. Alastair had made a clumsy, panicked introduction. "Aunt, this is Alara, a local healer who has been attending to my health." His aunt's gaze raked over Alara from the top of her simple, unbound hair to the tips of her sturdy shoes. It was a look of instant, dismissive appraisal, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture that is out of place. "A healer," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "How rustic. I had heard you'd dismissed the royal physician. I see now you've chosen to dabble in folk remedies." The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Throughout the excruciatingly formal dinner that evening, Lady Beatrice directed a barrage of pointed questions and thinly veiled insults, all designed to highlight Alara's commonness and Alastair's bizarre lapse in judgment. She spoke of court gossip, of advantageous alliances, of the impending arrival of Lady Annabel, a perfectly bred, perfectly boring daughter of an earl whom she had selected as Alastair's future duchess. Alara bore it all with a quiet, unassailable dignity that only seemed to infuriate the older woman more. She answered politely, her voice never wavering, but her eyes were filled with a deep, gathering hurt. The true pain came from Alistair. He sat at the head of the table, silent and grim, a prisoner in his own home. He did not defend Ilara. He did not contradict his aunt. His silence was a betrayal far deeper than any harsh word. Each moment he failed to speak for her. A piece of the beautiful, fragile thing they had built between them crumbled to dust. The final, brutal blow came later that night. Lady Beatrice cornered Alistair in the library, her voice a furious, sibilant whisper. "Have you lost your senses? You are the Duke of Blackwood. Your bloodline is one of the oldest in the kingdom, and you are allowing this nobody, this hedge witch, to play lady of the manor? Do you have any idea the scandal you are courting? I saw the way you look at her. It ends tonight. Send the creature back to her hovel and prepare to receive your intended bride." Unbeknownst to them, Ilara had come to the library to retrieve a book of herbal lore she had left behind. She stood in the shadows of the hallway, the heavy door slightly ajar, and heard every word. The clinical cruelty of the command, the venom in the word creature, was devastating. But it was Alistair's response that shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces. "You are right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation and defeat. "It was a temporary arrangement. She will be gone by morning." He did not raise his voice. He did not fight. He simply yielded. He had chosen his title, his duty, his prison over her. The warmth they had shared was a lie, a fleeting moment of weakness for him, a dalliance with a common girl who had soothed his fever. Humiliation, hot and sickening, washed over her. She was a fool. She had allowed herself to believe that the man she saw in the quiet moments was real. But he was a ghost, and the cold, powerful Duke was the reality. She did not wait to be dismissed like a servant. She fled. Back in her small room, she threw her few belongings into her satchel. She saw the fine leather-bound book of sonnets he had given her lying on her bedside table. With a sob of pure anguish, she left it behind. She could not bear to take a memento of a beautiful lie. Without a word to anyone, she slipped out of the great, dark manor, a ghost leaving a house of ghosts, and ran down the winding road toward the village, the cold night air scalding her lungs, the tears freezing on her cheeks. The frail Duke had been healed, but she was broken. Rain began to fall as Ilara fled the manor, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked her thin cloak and mirrored the despair in her soul. By the time she reached her cottage, she was drenched and shivering, but the chill went far deeper than her bones. It was a coldness of the spirit, a hollowing out of all the hope that had so recently bloomed there. The cottage, which had once felt like a lonely but safe harbor, now seemed a cage, a stark reminder of her place in the world. She lit a fire, her movements stiff and automatic. The small pile of coins the Duke's steward had pressed into her hand upon her arrival, the payment for that first night, sat on the mantelpiece. Felt like blood money. It was the price of her foolishness, the fee for her humiliation. In a sudden, furious gesture, she snatched the coins and flung them into the burgeoning flames. They hissed as they hit the embers, a sound of finality. She would not be bought. Her dignity was not for sale. She sank onto the hearth, wrapped her arms around her knees, and finally let the grief she had held at bay consume her. She wept for the man she thought she knew, the man who read poetry by the fire, the man who had shared his deepest wounds with her, and she wept for her own gullible heart. Back at the manor, the silence that descended after Ilara's departure was no longer peaceful. It was a dead, suffocating weight. Alistair stalked the halls like a caged beast, the warmth and light she had brought into the cold stone corridors now just a mocking memory. He found the book of sonnets in her empty room, a silent accusation on the nightstand. He picked it up, the leather cool beneath his fingers, and a wave of self-loathing so profound it nearly buckled his knees washed over him. His aunt found him there. "Good," she said, her voice crisp with satisfaction. "The distraction has been removed. Now we can focus on your future. Lady Annabel is everything a duchess should be." Something inside Alistair snapped. The years of repressed grief, of guilt, of lonely duty, erupted. He turned on her, his stormy eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen. "Future?" he snarled, the word a blade. "I have no future without her. You speak of bloodlines and titles, but you know nothing of life. That woman, in her simple dress and with her dirt-stained hands, has more life, more honor, more truth in her little finger than you and your entire vapid court have in your collective, shriveled hearts." He advanced on her, his presence so menacing that, for the first time in her life, Lady Beatrice took a step back. "You call her a hedge witch. You call her a creature. You are wrong. She is a healer. She did not just soothe my fever. She healed the rot in my soul. And I, in my cowardice, let you chase her away. I let her believe she was nothing more than a distraction." He laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You want me to marry for duty? To produce an heir for a title that has been nothing but a gilded cage? I will not. This title, this manor, this life, it is all dust without her. You have not saved me, Aunt. You have merely reminded me what it is to be in hell." He strode from the room, leaving his aunt speechless and pale. He went to his study and stared out the window at the rain-swept grounds. He saw it all with horrifying clarity. He had been so afraid of losing his title, but in his silence he had lost his self. He was a coward who had traded a universe of warmth for a kingdom of ice. Alara had offered him her soul, and he had offered her nothing. He had let her be humiliated to protect his own comfort. The realization was a physical blow. The frail Duke, indeed. His frailty had never been in his body. It was in his spirit. And now he had to prove to her and to himself that he could be strong enough to deserve her. He knew what he had to do. It would not be easy. It would mean defying a lifetime of expectation, of tradition, of duty. It would mean becoming a man Alara could respect again. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of damp earth. The villagers were stirring, their morning routines disrupted by a shocking sight. The Duke of Blackwood, who had not set foot in the village proper in years, was riding down the main street. He was not in his fine carriage, flanked by liveried outriders. He was on his favorite warhorse, alone, dressed not in silks and velvets, but in simple, practical riding clothes. His face was grim, determined, the scar a stark white line against his skin. Mud spattered his boots and the horse's flanks. He looked less like a duke and more like a soldier riding into a desperate battle. He dismounted before Alara's cottage, the entire village watching in stunned silence from their windows and doorways. He tethered his horse and walked to her door. He did not knock with the arrogance of his steward. He raised his hand and hesitated, then knocked softly, 3 gentle raps, the sound of a man asking for entry, not demanding it. Alara opened the door. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed and swollen from a night of weeping, but her back was straight, her expression guarded and proud. She would not show him her pain. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cold and formal, "you are a long way from your manor. Have you come to ensure the creature has returned to her hovel?" She used his aunt's cruel words like a shield. The barb hit its mark. He flinched, his face tight with shame. "Alara, I deserve that. I deserve every bit of your scorn." He did not try to enter, but stood on her threshold, a penitent. "I did not come as a duke. I came as the man you tried to heal. A foolish, cowardly man who needs to beg your forgiveness." The entire village was now openly staring, but Alistair did not seem to notice. His world had narrowed to the woman standing before him. "What you heard last night, my silence, it was the greatest failure of my life. I was trapped by a ghost, the ghost of my duty, of my name. But you taught me about ghosts, Alara. You taught me they don't have to be faced alone. And you taught me that they can be banished by the light." He took a deep breath, his voice ringing out in the clear morning air for all to hear. "I am Alistair. I am a man with a scarred face and a scarred soul. And I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your quiet dignity. You are not a distraction. You are the center of my world. The manor is just a pile of stones without you. My title is an empty word. He went down on one knee, there in the mud before her humble cottage, the great Duke of Blackwood kneeling to a common healer in full view of everyone. Gasps rippled through the assembled villagers. I am not offering you a title or a crown, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. I am offering you my heart, my life, my hand, all that I am and all that I ever hope to be. I am asking you, Alara, to save me from the ghosts for good. Marry me, not as a duchess, as my wife, my partner, my healer, my home. Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of disbelief, of hope, of a heart that had been shattered and was now, miraculously, being pieced back together, stronger than before. She saw the truth in his eyes, the raw vulnerability, the profound transformation. This was not the Duke. This was Alistair, her Alistair, the man who read poetry by the fire. He had found his courage. He had come for her. She looked at his upturned face, at the powerful nobleman kneeling in the dirt, offering her not his wealth, but his very self. And she gave him her answer. Get up, you fool, she whispered, a watery smile breaking through her tears. You'll ruin your britches. She reached out her hand, her strong, capable healer's hand, and pulled him to his feet. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong for all the world to hear. Yes, Alistair, I will. Their wedding was not a grand affair in the capital's cathedral. It took place a month later, in the simple stone church of the village, witnessed not by lords and ladies, but by farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants. Alara wore a simple dress of deep green wool, a crown of ivy in her hair. Alistair stood beside her, his ducal finery stored away, wearing a coat of fine but unadorned blue broadcloth. He looked at his bride not with the possessive pride of a nobleman acquiring an asset, but with a look of profound, reverent love. Lady Beatrice did not attend. She had retreated to her own estate in a state of apoplectic shock, declaring her nephew socially dead. Neither of them mourned her absence. Blackwood Manor began to change. Under Alara's guidance, it slowly shed its skin of gloom and sorrow. The heavy velvet curtains were thrown open, and sunlight, for the first time in years, was allowed to stream into the long-forgotten rooms. She replanted the gardens, her hands in the rich earth, coaxing life and color back into the neglected beds. Soon, the scent of roses and lavender drifted through the open windows, chasing away the last of the dust and decay. The conservatory, once a symbol of their aborted moment, became her domain, a lush, thriving jungle of green where she grew her herbs and taught Alistair the names of every plant. He, in turn, found a new purpose. He was no longer a recluse, hiding from the world. With Alara by his side, he began to engage with his tenants, not as a remote overlord, but as a landlord who cared for their welfare. He listened to their concerns, used his wealth to improve the village, and earned their respect not through his title, but through his actions. The villagers, who had once whispered about the monstrous Duke, now spoke with affection of the Duchess Alara and her husband. The manor was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of their life together, with conversation, with laughter, with the quiet rustle of pages as they read to each other by the fire in the library. His nightmares still came, sometimes, but they no longer held the same terror. When he woke in the night, Alara was there, her hand in his, a calm, steady anchor in the dark. He was her husband, her partner, the man she had healed. She was his wife, his confidant, the woman who had given him the courage to heal himself. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after they had met, they stood on a balcony overlooking the gardens, now a riot of late-blooming color. The air was clean and cool, full of the promise of a shared future. Alistair wrapped his arms around Alara from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. His scar was still there, a pale silver map of his past, but it no longer defined him. It was simply a part of the man she loved. Her hands, resting on his, were still the hands of a healer, strong and gentle. "Do you remember what you said?" he murmured into her hair. "About a wound of the soul needing another soul to mend it." I remember, she said, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. You were my cure, Ilara, he said, his voice quiet but certain. You always will be. She turned in his arms, her clear, honest eyes full of a love that was as deep and patient as the earth itself. They had faced down society, scandal, and their own private demons. They had built a life on a foundation of truth and mutual respect, a love that was stronger than any castle wall. The world outside might still whisper, but within the bounds of their home and their hearts, they had found a perfect, unassailable peace. A frail duke bought a single night of nursing, but their closeness became forbidden love.